They believed the hardest fighting was already behind them. The landings in North Africa had gone smoothly. The headlines were optimistic. And deep in the deserts of Tunisia, American commanders were convinced they were ready. What they didn't realize was that the enemy watching them had already fought, and won, against the best armies in Europe. In February 1943, the United States Army was about to face its first true test against Nazi Germany. Not a raid, not a limited skirmish, but a full-scale clash with seasoned German forces led by one of the most feared commanders of the war. What followed would shatter American confidence, expose fatal weaknesses, and leave hundreds dead or captured in just a matter of days. This was the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, and it was America's first shock in Second World War. To understand how the disaster unfolded, we have to go back several months earlier, to the optimism that blinded the U.S. Army to the danger ahead. In November 1942, Allied forces launched Operation Torch, landing in French North Africa. It was America's first major ground operation of the war. For many soldiers, it was their first time under fire. Yet the landings faced limited resistance. Vichy French forces quickly collapsed or switched sides. Ports were secured. Cities fell. The operation appeared to confirm what many American leaders already believed, that U.S. industrial strength, numbers, and enthusiasm would quickly overwhelm the Axis. But North Africa was not one. While American and British forces advanced eastward, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was doing what he did best, adapting. Fresh German units poured into Tunisia. Panzer divisions dug in. Defensive lines hardened. The desert, vast and unforgiving, became a chessboard of movement, supply, and timing. The Americans, meanwhile, were spread thin across wide distances. Their units were inexperienced. Many officers had never commanded troops in combat. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power existed more on paper than in reality. At the center of this fragile American line stood two corps, commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall. His headquarters was located nearly 70 miles behind the front, buried deep inside a reinforced bunker carved into a hillside. From there, orders traveled slowly. Situational awareness was poor, and trust between commanders and frontline units was dangerously thin. Fredendall believed dispersal was strength. His forces were scattered across mountain passes, valleys, and desert plains, each unit isolated, each position vulnerable. He was confident the Germans would never attempt a major breakthrough through the rugged terrain of central Tunisia. That assumption would soon prove catastrophic. Facing the Americans was the Afrika Korps, hardened veterans of desert warfare. They had survived British offensives, shortages, and constant pressure. Their commanders understood maneuver warfare. They knew how to concentrate force, exploit weak points, and strike fast. Rommel saw the American positions and immediately recognized the opportunity. The Kasserine Pass was a narrow gap through the Atlas Mountains. If breached, German forces could pour into the Allied rear, threaten supply lines, and regain the initiative in North Africa. To Rommel, it was an open door. To the Americans, it was just another sector. On February 14, 1943, German and Italian units began probing attacks along the American front. At first, these seemed minor. Skirmishes, reconnaissance in force. U.S. commanders interpreted them as limited actions, nothing they couldn't handle. But the warning signs were already there. German tanks moved with speed and coordination the Americans had never faced. Artillery fire was precise. Infantry assaults were disciplined and relentless. Entire American units found themselves outflanked before they realized they were under serious attack. Communications broke down almost immediately. Radio networks failed. Orders contradicted one another. Some units were told to hold at all costs, while others were ordered to withdraw, often without knowing what neighboring units were doing. The battlefield became fragmented and confused. Then the main blow fell. On February 19, German armor surged through the Kasserine Pass. Panzer divisions smashed into poorly prepared American defenses. Anti-tank guns were knocked out. Infantry positions were overrun. Tanks were destroyed before they could even maneuver. Many American soldiers fought bravely, but bravery could not compensate for inexperience, poor leadership, and tactical confusion. Entire units collapsed under pressure. Retreats turned into routes. Within hours, the U.S. line was shattered. And this was only the beginning. As German forces pushed deeper through the Kasserine Pass, the American collapse accelerated. What had begun as a coordinated defense dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance, each fighting its own war, often unaware that neighboring units had already fallen back or been destroyed. German tanks advanced in tight formations, supported by mobile artillery and experienced infantry. They exploited every weakness. American positions were often placed too far apart, making mutual support impossible. When one position fell, the next was exposed almost immediately. For many American soldiers, this was their first encounter with modern armored warfare. German panzer crews moved with deadly precision, striking quickly, repositioning, then striking again. U.S. anti-tank guns were frequently knocked out before crews could properly engage. Tank units, lacking coordination with infantry, were picked off one by one. Air support, which American planners relied on heavily, failed to deliver when it mattered most. Poor communication between ground units and aircraft meant close air support arrived late, targeted the wrong areas, or failed to appear at all. In contrast, German air units struck with devastating accuracy, bombing retreating columns and supply routes. The battlefield descended into chaos. Orders from headquarters were often unclear or arrived too late to matter. General Fredendall, far from the front, attempted to direct the battle through fragmented reports and delayed messages. Frontline commanders found themselves making critical decisions without guidance, while higher command remained dangerously disconnected from reality. One American unit after another was forced to withdraw. In some cases, the retreat was orderly. In others, it was a desperate scramble under fire. Abandoned vehicles littered the desert. Ammunition dumps were left behind. Fuel trucks were destroyed to prevent capture. At Sidi Bou Zid, one of the most critical sectors, American forces were caught in exposed positions with little cover. German armor encircled them with ruthless efficiency. By the end of the day, the position had collapsed entirely. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed or captured. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some troops believed German forces were everywhere. Others feared they were being deliberately sacrificed. Confidence in leadership eroded by the hour. The belief that American strength alone would carry the day was shattered in real time. Yet the Germans, too, were operating under constraints. Rommel's forces were stretched thin. Supplies were limited. Fuel shortages loomed constantly. His objective was not total destruction of American forces, but disruption to break Allied momentum and buy time. Still, the opportunity was too tempting to ignore. German forces pressed forward, threatening to burst out of the mountain passes and into the Allied rear. If successful, they could roll up supply lines, isolate units, and potentially force a major Allied withdrawal across Tunisia. It was at this moment, with the situation nearing catastrophe, that Allied command began to react decisively. British units were rushed to stabilize the line. Artillery was concentrated instead of dispersed. Defensive positions were reorganized with clear fields of fire. For the first time, American units began fighting alongside experienced British formations that understood how to counter German tactics. Gradually, the German advance slowed. At critical choke points, Allied artillery unleashed devastating barrages. Tanks were finally positioned to support infantry rather than operate independently. Air support, once disorganized, began striking German supply columns and armored concentrations with greater effectiveness. The fighting remained brutal, but momentum shifted. By February 22, the German advance had reached its limit. Rommel, facing mounting resistance and worsening supply problems, ordered a withdrawal. The battlefield fell silent, but the damage was done. The Americans had suffered a humiliating defeat. More than 300 soldiers were killed. Thousands were wounded or captured. Entire units had been rendered combat ineffective. Equipment losses were severe, but the most significant damage was intangible. Confidence had been destroyed. Yet within that defeat lay the seeds of transformation. In the immediate aftermath of Kasserine, there was no victory to celebrate, only reckoning. American commanders walked the battlefield and saw the evidence of failure everywhere. Burned-out tanks, abandoned artillery, supply trucks riddled with shrapnel. Positions that had never been properly prepared now stood silent, overrun without a fight or abandoned in panic. The desert preserved the wreckage like a museum of mistakes. What troubled Allied leadership most was not simply that the Americans had lost. It was how they had lost. The defeat exposed deep structural problems inside the U.S. Army. Units had fought as separate elements rather than as a unified force. Infantry advanced without armor. Tanks attacked without artillery support. Air power operated almost independently of ground commanders. There was no true combined arms doctrine in practice, only theory. And leadership, more than anything else, came under scrutiny. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the overall Allied commander in North Africa, understood the implications immediately. Kasserine was not an isolated failure. It was a warning. If these same mistakes were repeated in future operations, especially against stronger defenses in Europe, the consequences would be catastrophic. Changes came swiftly. General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved of command. His distant leadership style and rigid control from far behind the lines were judged incompatible with modern warfare. In his place came leaders who believed command belonged closer to the front, where decisions could be made with clarity and speed. One name stood out above all others: George S. Patton. Patton was brought in to restore discipline, confidence, and aggression within two corps. His arrival was immediate and unmistakable. Helmets were worn properly. Units were reorganized. Officers were expected to lead from the front. Hesitation was no longer tolerated. But Patton's influence was not about bravado alone. He demanded coordination. Tanks would support infantry. Artillery would be massed and used decisively. Communications would be simplified. Orders would be clear and enforceable. For the first time, American forces began operating as a modern, integrated fighting machine. Training intensified under combat conditions. Units drilled relentlessly, learning from their mistakes while still within range of the enemy. After-action reports were taken seriously. Lessons from British experience were absorbed instead of dismissed. The transformation was painful but necessary. Meanwhile, German commanders reflected on Kasserine with a different perspective. They had delivered a sharp blow, but they had failed to destroy American forces entirely. Supply shortages, Allied resistance, and the growing strength of Allied air power limited what Rommel could achieve. And critically, Rommel sensed that the Americans were changing. Within weeks, U.S. units re-entered combat with greater confidence and cohesion. At El Getter, American forces successfully halted German armored attacks using well-coordinated artillery and anti-tank defenses. It was not flawless, but it worked. The psychological shift was unmistakable. American soldiers no longer believed the Germans were invincible. They understood now what modern warfare demanded. The shock of Kasserine had stripped away illusions and replaced them with hard-earned experience. The defeat had forced evolution. By the time Allied forces pushed eastward through Tunisia, the U.S. Army that emerged bore little resemblance to the one that had entered North Africa months earlier. Leadership was sharper. Doctrine was practical. Coordination had become instinct rather than theory. Kasserine, once a symbol of humiliation, was quietly becoming something else. A turning point. But its legacy would extend far beyond North Africa. The lessons learned in those mountain passes would shape every major American operation that followed, from Sicily to Normandy, from the hedgerows of France to the heart of Germany itself. And in that sense, the defeat at Kasserine may have saved the U.S. Army from a far greater disaster yet to come. The Battle of the Kasserine Pass did not end with a decisive German victory or an Allied triumph. It ended with something far more unsettling, a realization. For the United States Army, Kasserine stripped away every comforting assumption. Industrial power, numbers, and enthusiasm were not enough. Modern war demanded experience, adaptability, and leadership under pressure. At Kasserine, the U.S. Army learned that lesson the hard way. In Washington and London, reports from Tunisia were studied carefully. The defeat was not hidden or ignored. It was dissected. Tactical failures were catalogued. Command structures were questioned. Training doctrines were rewritten. Kasserine became a case study, not in defeat but in correction. American commanders now understood that dispersing forces invited destruction. Units had to fight together or not at all. Artillery, once treated as a supporting arm, became the backbone of American battlefield dominance. Communication systems were simplified and hardened. Air-ground coordination, once chaotic, became systematic. Most importantly, leadership culture changed. Officers were expected to lead forward, not from bunkers miles away. Commanders who hesitated were replaced. Those who adapted were promoted. Combat experience became the ultimate credential. The U.S. Army began rewarding initiative instead of rigid obedience. The transformation was visible within months. In Sicily, American forces fought with greater cohesion. In Italy, they absorbed losses without collapsing. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, the U.S. Army had become a disciplined, resilient, and adaptive fighting force, shaped by the memory of its first major defeat. Kasserine was never meant to be remembered as a victory. It was a failure, a painful one. Hundreds of lives were lost because of mistakes that should never have been made. But unlike many disasters in military history, this one was not repeated. The shock at Kasserine forced the United States Army to grow up quickly, before facing the even deadlier battlefields of Europe. It taught commanders that war punishes arrogance and rewards preparation. It showed soldiers that survival depended on trust, coordination, and leadership under fire. In the narrow passes of Tunisia, America lost its innocence. And in doing so, it gained the experience it would need to win the war. If you found this story valuable, consider liking the video and subscribing for more untold Second World War missions that failed, collapsed, or nearly changed history. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle you want explored next.